The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we began with an examination of what have been called food deserts or food wastelands, and their impact on the health and wealth of communities, especially those of people of color. We'll continue that conversation this week with a man called the Sioux Chef, winner of not just one, but several of the highly coveted James Beard Awards. Sean Sherman has made it his mission to address not only the food deserts confronting indigenous communities, but also the related economic and health crises. We'll begin with a brief orientation video put together by Sean and his team. Well, we're very pleased to have Sean Sherman with us. He is the founder and the CEO chef of the Sioux Chef. And among his many accolades and accomplishments is this book, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. I've not tried the recipes yet, but I'm looking forward to that very, very much, Sean. Among your other honors and milestones was serving the first, as I understand, decolonized dinner at the James Beard House in New York City. From what I understand, that's sort of the culinary equivalent of getting an Oscar or an Emmy. Can you tell us why that was such a prestigious invitation?
For a long time, the James Beard House, which was literally his house, after he passed and moved on, they converted it as a space to continue his work, which was bringing in chefs, bringing in creatives, hosting dinners. And so we were invited to do that a while back now. And, of course, we're just doing something different. So it definitely totally stands out. And, the James Beard Awards are a pretty big deal for restaurant people in the industry. And, so I feel lucky that I have 3 awards and a nomination. So it's been quite the path.
When you describe this as a decolonized dinner, can you give us a little insight into what that means precisely, and then how that determined what you chose to serve for that dinner?
Absolutely. So basically what we focus on is Native American indigenous foods. Myself, I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux Tribe, and I've been working in kitchens and restaurants basically ever since I was 13 years old. So pretty much my whole life, it feels like. And, I worked my way up into an executive chef position when I was pretty young and worked for lots of restaurants and had a pretty good career doing that. But a little ways into that career, I had the epiphany of doing what I'm doing now, which was this focus on indigenous foods, because I realized the complete absence of indigenous foods out there. There were no Native American restaurants. There were very few cookbooks on the subject. And the few cookbooks that were out there seemed very fusionized with a lot of things.
Mhm.
So I just really wanted to come up with a different philosophy, and I worked on it for quite a few years to try to understand personally what that meant. And so I started really being curious what my Lakota ancestors were eating, harvesting, foraging, preserving, trading, all these things, and how they were processing foods. And so as I studied more, it really kind of forced me into understanding a lot more about the history of why things they are the way they are, and why we don't have Native American restaurants in every single city. And it really painted a picture of what is US colonialism and just understanding what that meant. And I started, when I started doing the Sioux Chef, I not only started just doing these foods, but I started doing a lot of talks. So I've been to many different universities, I've been to countries all over the world, and I basically kind of spell out like what happened with relations between indigenous peoples of North America and especially the US government, and just kind of showing that. So when we're using terms like decolonize, it's really kind of understanding what colonization actually means to us as indigenous peoples in the US,
Hmm.
because colonization was the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And it's not unique to North America because it's happened all over the globe.
Hmm.
But, you know, for me, focused on just North America because that's where we are in the US, especially, and just looking at how US colonialism affected Indigenous peoples. So when I started creating Indigenous foods, we really wanted to push back against the European influence to showcase there was a lot of amazing foods and flavors out there across the board and so much diversity. So part of the philosophy was just cutting away colonial ingredients. So we removed things that didn't exist here before. So no dairy, no wheat flour, no cane sugar, no beef, pork, or chicken. And there happens to be a lot of food beyond those pieces, you know. So it became a big study in wild foods, native agriculture, understanding what seeds are still alive out there, food processing and food preservation. And it's really just kind of taking back what is indigenous education in a non-colonized, non-Eurocentric education viewpoint and spelling that out and being able to tell that story through food.
Hmm. So, what precisely did you serve that particular evening at James Beard House?
Oh, that was a while back, but you know, we focused on trying to create a menu that really represented what was indigenous Manhattan, because obviously you're on that island, particularly, there's barely anything left that's organic or natural, and you know, it was an interesting showpiece to be able to show that even though this status is like this with this huge city built on this land, we still know the history, we still know the tribes that live here, that they're still around the area,
Hmm.
we still know the foods that they would have had here on this island, particularly the kind of seafood, the kind of land animals, the kind of wild foods, the kind of native agriculture that was huge out in that region. And we started to put together foods from those pieces. And we worked really hard trying to source from a lot of indigenous producers out on the East Coast. So we had found like we found a fishing group right outside of Long Island, and they were, you know, a native fishing group and bringing in lots of interesting things.
Hmm.
We were using some seed savers in northern New York, so we were able to get a lot of cool varietals of indigenous corns and beans and squash and sunflower seeds and things like that. And you know, we just had a lot of fun with that dinner, and that's been our style. Like we've been able to do these pop-up dinners all over the U.S., parts of Canada, up in Alaska, down in Mexico, and really focused on just where we are and looking at it through that indigenous pre-colonial perspective.
It sounds like this had to involve considerable research on your part. Were you able to pull some of the nature of a decolonized dinner or pre-colonization foods from elders within Lakota Nation or other tribes, or did you have to go even beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, initially I just started looking around, and it was hard to figure out where to start. Luckily for me, I had some botany in my background because I worked for the U.S. Forest Service right out of high
Hmm.
school. So my job was a field surveyor at a very young age, and I had to learn the names of all the trees and plants inside the northern Black Hills. So just realizing how much plant diversity out there was a really kind of big leg up of just understanding that piece. And then when I started talking to elders, one of my uncles, he has quite a few different degrees, but he's an ethnobotanist and he just really loves the plants of the what is around the Pine Ridge region and the Badlands area of South Dakota. And he just knows those histories so well. So I did have people in my family that were able to help out, but you know, a lot of the elders at the time I was searching had also gone through assimilation, also gone through a different
Hmm.
education form. So you know, a lot of the knowledge was obviously broken because of colonization, because of reservation systems, because of boarding schools.
Hmm.
And so, you know, for me, I really kind of went to nature. I went outdoors. I really connected with the plants. I started like really learning how to identify and bring these foods back into the kitchen and start to play with them and try to keep, try to find a relationship with them, basically. I also connected with lots of seed savers and seed keepers out there, trying to understand how many indigenous seeds were still alive. So I've been on the board with Seed Savers Exchange for maybe 7 or 8 years now, and just really trying to understand all those pieces, because the migration of agriculture is a really amazing untold history of North America,
Hmm.
with corn culture starting at the bottom of Mexico and basically shooting both directions and crawling throughout all of Mexico, the Caribbean, the Mississippi, Missouri River valleys, all the way throughout the East Coast. And there's just so much massive indigenous agriculture that was going on out in those areas and growing the same things in that whole stretch, varieties of corn, varieties of beans, varieties of squash, varieties of sunflower seeds, and tobacco and cotton and all these things. So there's just so much to explore, so much to understand. So for me, it's a lifelong journey. I'll never get to the end of understanding all of it because there's too much diversity out there. But, that's not a bad problem to have.
No, not at all. Let's circle back. You've referenced a couple times your childhood on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Can you give us a sense of what your childhood was like, uh, and what led you on the path that you followed? How somehow that caused you to come back to that inspiration or to follow that path?
Well, I mean, I would say we had a lot of freedom growing up. I did grow up in the 70s and early 80s, and parenting was a little bit loose back then, and even more so on the reservation, maybe. I always tease my parents that, boomers didn't really raise us as a generation. They just kicked us outside until dark, and that was basically it. And so we spent a lot of time outdoors. TV wasn't a thing where I grew up. Like, we definitely had a TV, but we didn't have that many channels. I think we had two and a half, to be exact. So we were just very curious. We were always outside. We were always just, using our imagination and just being outdoors, and a little feral, but not bad. We all survived. So, and again, I grew up on my grandfather's ranch, so we had access to horses. There was just endless plains out there. We were so close to the Badlands. I remember finding dinosaur bones as kids and just tossing them aside because I didn't really think much of them. Just like more rocks, until like later in life I realized some of those were worth thousands of dollars as we grew up extremely poor. And so it was an interesting childhood. And we spent a lot of summers in the Black Hills. My grandparents had a cabin in the Black Hills, so we'd go up there for a few weeks at a time and just run around these hills and climb up cliffs and rocks and just kind of explore as much as we could. So a lot of time outdoors for me. And so for me, I think that was a really great way to grow up. Just having that freedom, having that ability to see outside, to see the world, and to just be connected, to where you are. So it's not a childhood that I don't think most kids have anymore.
No, and I wonder, looking at your website, Sean, and also reading your book, you talked about the place of hunting and fishing, and you've already talked about foraging and that sort of thing. Do you think that's part of the problem in terms of the food industry and the way people relate to their food? Is simply there's not that sense of where it originated from, and it's just something that arrives magically packaged in their local supermarket?
Absolutely, because I've been in restaurants for a long time, and get these young kids from the suburbs right out of high school, and they can't even identify what a salary looks like. And it's no offense to them. It's just that they're so used to having everything provided for them, and they never really have to think about where food comes from. And I
Hmm.
think it is an issue. And I think the pandemic really highlighted, how broken the system can be easily, with something like what happened to us during COVID, and it's still happening, but it changed everything. And I think that, for us, it didn't affect us as much for the foods that we were serving, because we did a lot of food relief. We were doing up to 10,000 meals a week during the
Wow.
pandemic. But, we knew exactly who we're buying our food from, because we were just reaching out to our local people and finding out what they had to move. And we were just
Hmm.
moving it and creating recipes with what was around us. And so I think, it's really important for people to understand that local isn't just a key word, buying local isn't just a key word, that it's really something that's an important piece to the puzzle. Like, we need to localize our food systems. We need to keep those food dollars within our own region to help
Hmm.
support of the food growth out there, and really looking for people who are doing things organically, of course, utilizing more permaculture. And as we grow, and showcasing a lot more plant diversity in the foods that we're serving, hoping to be role models for opening up people's eyes to use a lot more wild plants and just using the world where they might live a little bit better.
Now, as you look at the foods that you're developing and the overall enterprises that you've developed, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, that did not match your early experience growing up on the reservation in terms of foods that were provided to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what impact that had in terms of the health experiences of the people that grew up on a reservation or lived on a reservation?
Absolutely, because we were lucky having my grandparents' ranch because we did have access to a lot of beef, which wasn't typical for a lot of families out there. But we still grew up primarily with a lot of commodity foods in our cupboards, and so the commodity food program's been around for a while. And there's also the USDA also runs the FDPIR, which is the federally distributed Indian something acronym. Sorry, can't remember, but but it's been around for a long time, and unfortunately, those food sources do not have a lot of healthy nutrition in them, and it's
Mhm.
really hard to create nutritional foods because it's people are used to seeing these foods in schools, they're seeing these foods in hospitals. Of course, the military utilizes versions of these foods, and but for native reservations out there, indigenous reservations that there people are still utilizing that today. And some communities are still rural that it's hard to get a lot of food access. So if your cupboards are filled with commodity foods and your local food source is a gas station, there's a direct connection to why some of these communities could have upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes and massive amounts of obesity and heart disease and all these other foodborne illnesses. So, for us, we're just trying to showcase a better way. We're trying to figure out ways to make indigenous foods more accessible. We're trying to create a lot more education around that because the two pieces go hand in hand. And we're just looking at ways to kind of problem solve of how can we change those systems? How can we make sure the next generation isn't stuck on just these unhealthy food bases with lots of white carbs that just create all sorts of health problems. So there's a lot to do, but we see very direct paths, and that's the whole reason we set up the nonprofit that we have here in Minnesota, which is called
Mhm.
Natives. It's an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, and people can visit natives.org for more information. But we just have this grand plan of creating centralized regional center points to help develop more indigenous food operations, create food access, create distribution points, create a lot more education, and just support a lot of the tribal communities that are out there to adapt a lot more healthier indigenous foods into their communities.
When you begin to make available the various foods that you have developed or redeveloped, do you find that there's difficulty getting people who have been grown up on processed foods, fast foods, etc., to switch their diets, or is it almost a revelation and a sense of pride for them to be able to have that available and begin utilizing?
It's a little bit of both because I mean, obviously, people love the comfort foods that they're used to, that they've grown up with, that they know how to make, and a lot of it is unfortunately processed food,
Hmm.
and but also people do feel a big sense of pride of knowing some of these ingredients, and seeing some creative foods coming out of some of these ingredients, and so we're hoping just to try to be role models, and that's what the whole point of the restaurant was here in Minneapolis, was just being showcasing what's possible for modern indigenous foods, because we're not trying to recreate the past and cook like 1491. We're trying to create a path that showcases what's possible moving forward, like what can we
Hmm.
do now and what's possible in the future. So we just have a lot of options out there, and we're growing a big team. I think we had almost 150 employees this last summer at our busiest time period, and we're just going to keep building and growing more, but
Hmm.
we're bringing in a whole new generation of young native talents and chefs. And I think it's going to be an exciting time as we see more and more indigenous focused restaurants opening up across everywhere, hopefully.
On your website, you had, I found it a rather stunning graphic time lapse of the onset of colonialism and the takeover of indigenous lands and then the development of reservations. I'd like to go to
Mhm.
that video just briefly, and we're going to play that with your description at the time. And
Sure.
once we come back, then I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But let's take a look at that video.
First off, just to get everybody on the same page, like what is colonialism? The easiest way to understand colonialism, Google. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So we see this happen in history a lot, right? We see a heavily coming out of Europe during the age of exploration, and we see, basically going all around the world: Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the Americas. All of this area is being affected by European colonialism. People are getting pushed around, people are getting delocated, all sorts of bad things are happening. But then we look at U.S. colonialism, which is something very recent and people don't understand. So at the beginning of our country, in the late 1700s, still over 80% of the entire part of the land was still under indigenous control at that point in time. So Native American history isn't something that's ancient history, right? It's very recent. So again, this is just the era of my great-grandfather. So you'll see how fast that the U.S. government starts to push to take over indigenous people's lands. And it happens really fast, and especially after Civil War. So basically between the years of 1840 and 1870, almost all of the land is taken over, and during that time the same thing is happening. People are being dislocated, they're getting pushed around, people are getting pushed into Oklahoma, entire families are getting wiped out. All of these farming communities, seeds are disappearing from these, all this farming that's happening on the eastern side of the United States, and it happens really, really fast. So for me, it was just kind of an eye-opener to think about like how recent this is and how little people don't understand our own histories, right? Because I mean, if all you read about in history is from your high school textbooks, you're going to have a very skewed sense of American history, since it was written by the U.S. government. So at the end of the 1800s, we have very little of any control of our lands left. So we lost a lot of things during that time period. So we're kind of in the sense of kind of traumatic healing at this point. We're barely getting to the point of healing. We just went through a very traumatic time period, and a very recent time period too.
Sean, to follow on the video that we just shared that you had used, I think, on a presentation in Napa, California, if you could share with us a little bit about the ongoing impact of colonialism, both in your experience as a member of Lakota Nation, but also from other people within the indigenous communities throughout the United States.
Yeah, I mean, because we look at indigenous issues on a global scale, really. It's a very pan-indigenous kind of perspective, because we see colonialism that happened everywhere and is still happening in parts of the world, So obviously places like Brazil was still like murdering indigenous peoples and just very recently, And, so there's a lot of extreme violence that happens. There's a lot of twisting of histories that happen, because we grow up not even knowing a lot of these true histories that happened right here on the land spaces that we're growing up. Like, you can find them if you dig for them, but they're not available to our education system, and we're in a weird time period where, people are getting punished, and some states are completely removing uncomfortable histories from their curriculum, which is not a good move, because we should be very aware of a lot of the atrocities that some people had to go through, and some people continue to go through even still today. But so colonialism not only brings on an immense amount of this violence and this culture clash, but I just feel like where we are in the United States government has never really taken into account or just like accepted its own history of how it became a world power off of stolen indigenous land spaces. On top of that, stealing a lot of indigenous peoples from Africa to utilize as forced labor to just build a massive economy. And, there's a lot of effects that are still very much apparent. Land ownership is a huge one, because if you look at all privatized land in the United States, it's still 98% white right now today, which is a direct result of that U.S. colonialism. And, it's just kind of, and that cultural dominance that's been set kind of into the whole structure of it. And so we just have a lot of pieces to do. Our education system's a mess, our healthcare system's a mess, our our food systems are a mess. And, if we look at how indigenous communities are surviving for millennia, there's a lot of really wonderful answers out there because we could be utilizing a lot more localized agriculture. We could be utilizing a lot more permaculture and just growing food plants everywhere. I
Mhm.
always say in my talks that lawns are stupid and we should just be putting food everywhere we absolutely can. But we also need trained people to know what to do with all these foods, both wild and domesticated, how to preserve them, how to create pantry items out of them, and how to,
Mhm.
support people because, everybody deserves food out there. And a lot of indigenous communities, that was just, part of their philosophy that they would feed anybody that needed food. But today, food is being under a capitalistic system. Like it's really the rich that can afford food. And it really does depend on your zip code of what kind of nutritional access you have available, to your house and to your community. So there's a lot of massive changes that we need to focus. And even a restaurant is a tough business. Obviously, it's kind of probably one of the worst businesses to be in, but a really good restaurant could be extremely influential, and that's what we're hoping, that we could just be a really strong role model for doing something different, for doing something a lot more intentional, for really considering who we're buying our food from and why we're putting this food on the menu, to be thinking a lot more seasonal, to be utilizing a lot more wild foods and even alternative proteins, because we don't have beef, pork, or chicken on the menu. We don't have
Mhm.
dairy. We don't have wheat flour. We don't have ranch dressing or ketchup or soda. We just have a lot of really wonderful foods that largely represents the land that it happens to sit on.
Well, this leads us very nicely into the next part of what we'd like to talk about with you, and that is how you are taking this inspiration and not only addressing that within the Minneapolis area, but also what you're trying to do nationwide and continent-wide. Uh, I knew that we'd not be able to fit this in the context of one program, so we're going to thank you right now and hope that everybody will rejoin us for part 2 of this conversation in next week's edition of Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.